Welcome to Dreamy History. Here's the thing that blows my mind when we talk about the ancient Britons. The very concept of a singular Briton is a profound anachronism for most of the deep past we're about to explore. We imagine a continuous line, a steady progression of people who were always British and always lived on Britain. But the truth is far more fluid, far more fascinating, and frankly, a lot stranger than that simple narrative suggests. For hundreds of thousands of years, the landmass we now call Britain was not an island. It was not always inhabited, and its occupants were certainly not Britons in any sense we'd recognise. Think about this for a second. The earliest human ancestors to set foot on this soil weren't even Homo sapiens. They were a different species entirely, crossing land bridges that have long since vanished beneath the waves, navigating a landscape utterly alien to our modern imagination, a land of woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and vast undulating ice sheets. This wasn't a static, isolated island. It was a dynamic, shifting frontier, repeatedly colonized, abandoned and recolonized, its very geography sculpted and resculpted by the immense power of glacial cycles. We're talking about a story of profound demographic upheaval, of entire populations disappearing and reappearing, driven by climate change on a scale that dwarfs anything we face today. It's a story of survival, adaptation, and the relentless march of geological time, all playing out on a stage that was only intermittently an island. What we call Britain today is merely the latest iteration of a land that has worn many faces and hosted many different peoples, none of whom initially considered themselves British. This deep history, stretching back into the mists of prehistory, isn't just a prelude. It's the foundational narrative that shaped everything that came after, defining the very contours of human experience on this unique edge of the European continent. If you're enjoying this journey through history, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And I'm always curious, drop a comment letting me know what city and time zone you're watching from. There's something special about knowing this story is reaching people all over the world. Let's start with the obvious question. Nobody asks, what was Britain before it was Britain? For hundreds of thousands of years, the landmass that would eventually become an island nation was nothing of the sort. It was a shifting, dynamic peninsula, connected to mainland Europe by vast plains that now lie submerged beneath the North Sea. This deep prehistory is a story not of a single continuous people, but of repeated migrations, climate shifts, and the slow, inexorable grind of geological forces. The earliest evidence of hominin presence on this land dates back an astonishing 900,000 years, found at Happisburgh in Norfolk. This wasn't Homo sapiens as we know ourselves, but likely Homo antecessor, or Homo heidelbergensis, distant cousins who braved a cold northern European landscape. Imagine this, a world utterly transformed. The North Sea basin was a vast open plain crisscrossed by rivers, porting megafauna like mammoth, rhinoceros, and ancient deer. These early inhabitants were intrepid hunter-gatherers, following herds, crafting crude flint tools, and surviving in an environment that would have pushed even modern humans to their absolute limits. We find their footprints preserved in ancient estuarine muds, a hauntingly direct connection to a world almost unimaginably distant. By about 500,000 years ago, we have stronger evidence from sites like Boxgrove in West Sussex. Here, Homo heidelbergensis left behind exquisitely crafted flint hand axes, known as Aculean tools, alongside the butchered bones of rhinoceros, horse and bear. These were sophisticated hunters, not just scavengers. They understood their landscape, the movements of animals, and possessed the cognitive abilities to plan and execute complex tasks. But this presence was never permanent. The cycles of glacial advance and retreat, the ice ages, repeatedly scoured the land, rendering it uninhabitable for vast stretches of time. Each cold snap would drive populations south, only for warmer interglacial periods to allow new waves of recolonization, often by different hominin groups. The Neanderthals, a more robust and cold-adapted species, arrived around 250,000 years ago, leaving traces in caves like Kent's Cavern in Devon. They were masters of survival in harsh environments, utilizing fire, complex hunting strategies, and even caring for their sick and elderly. But even they were not immune to the planet's dramatic shifts. The last glacial maximum, peaking around 20,000 BCE, was an epoch of profound cold. Ice sheets up to a mile thick covered much of Britain, pushing south as far as the modern-day Thames estuary. Life was simply impossible in most regions. The land bridge to Europe, which had been exposed during lower sea levels, became a frozen, barren wasteland, effectively severing this northern outpost from the continent. When anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, finally arrived in significant numbers. It was after this great ice age began to recede, around 10,000 BCE. The land was emerging from under its icy shroud, slowly transforming from tundra to forest. This period, known as the Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age, saw the first sustained human occupation of the re-emerging landmass. These were highly mobile hunter-gatherers, adept at exploiting the diverse resources of a warming environment. They hunted red deer, wild boar, and aurochs, fished in rivers and coastal waters, and gathered nuts, berries, and roots. Their tools were refined. Tiny, geometrically shaped flints called microliths, often hafted onto wooden shafts to create spears, arrows, and harpoons. One of the most remarkable features of this era was Doggerland, a vast, fertile plain that connected what is now eastern England to the Netherlands and Denmark. Imagine a lost continent, rich with meandering rivers, lakes, and dense forests, supporting an abundance of wildlife. For thousands of years, this was the heartland of Mesolithic life, a broad bridge across which people, animals, and ideas moved freely. But its fate was sealed by the melting glaciers. As global temperatures rose, the sea levels inexorably climbed, slowly but surely consuming Doggerland. We don't have a single dramatic flood event. Rather, it was a gradual, relentless inundation, transforming a land bridge into a series of islands, and finally into the floor of the North Sea. This geological event, occurring over millennia, was perhaps the most defining moment in the formation of Britain as a distinct geographic entity, severing its direct connection to the continent and setting the stage for a unique island history. The loss of Doggerland, complete by around 6500 BCE, meant that future migrations to this emerging island required crossing water. This isolation, however, didn't stop the next great wave of change, the Neolithic Revolution. Around 4000 BCE, a new way of life arrived, likely brought by migrants from mainland Europe who possessed a fundamentally different relationship with the land. These were farmers. They brought domesticated crops like wheat and barley, and livestock such as cattle, sheep, and pigs. This wasn't just a change in diet, it was a complete societal transformation. Instead of following herds, people began to settle, clearing forests, cultivating fields, and building permanent dwellings. the landscape itself began to reflect human intervention on an unprecedented scale. This shift from nomadic hunter-gathering to settled agriculture had profound consequences. Population densities increased, social structures became more complex, and a new emphasis on ancestry and communal identity emerged. We see this most dramatically in their monumental architecture. The Neolithic people built massive earthen structures, long barrows for communal burials, causewayed enclosures for gatherings, and eventually the first phases of what would become the iconic stone circles. These weren't just functional structures, they were expressions of belief, social cohesion, and a deep connection to the land and their ancestors. The very act of investing so much labour in these enduring monuments speaks to a profound shift in mindset, a desire to leave a lasting mark on a landscape they now called home, and we're only getting started. The Neolithic era laid the groundwork for complex societies, but it was the arrival of a new material, metal, that would once again redefine life on this island, ushering in the Bronze Age and an era of unprecedented trade, conflict, and social stratification. But that's a story for the next chapter. So we left off with the Neolithic Revolution, didn't we? Imagine it, a profound shift, the kind that fundamentally rewrites humanity's relationship with the land. No longer were people just passing through, taking what nature offered. Now they were shaping it. They were farmers, rooted to the soil, building communities, creating surplus, and, crucially, constructing these incredible enduring monuments, the long barrows, the causewayed enclosures, the early phases of what would become the most famous stone circle in the world. This was a world of stability, of growing populations, of a deep, almost spiritual connection to the ancestors buried in those earth mounds, watching over the fields. But history, my friends, is never static. Just when you think you've got a handle on the narrative, something new comes along to shake everything up. And in this case, that something was metal. Think about the sheer wonder of it for a moment. For hundreds of thousands of years, every tool, every weapon, every ornament had been made from stone, bone, wood, or antler. Suddenly a new material appears. You can melt it, mould it, hammer it into shapes impossible with flint or chert. It gleams, it's durable, it's different. This wasn't an invention that sprang fully formed from the minds of the people in Britain. Oh no. Like so many transformative ideas before it, metalworking was an import, a technological leap that rippled across the continent and eventually, inevitably, reached these shores. We're talking about the Copper Age first, roughly starting around 2500 BCE in Britain, though it had been flourishing in places like the Balkans and Iberia for millennia before. Copper itself is soft, not much better than a good flint axe for most tasks, but it was a prestige item, it was rare, it was cool, and the people who brought this new technology, this new aesthetic, were a fascinating group we often refer to as the Beaker people. Now here's the thing that blows my mind about the Beaker people. For a long time we thought of them as a distinct ethnic group who migrated en masse, conquering or displacing the existing Neolithic populations. Their signature pottery, the distinctive bell-shaped beaker pots, often beautifully decorated, showed up everywhere, from Iberia to Central Europe to Britain. It looked like a clear migratory wave, but recent genetic studies using ancient DNA have painted a far more nuanced picture. What these studies suggest is that while the culture of the Beaker people, their pottery, their burial rituals, their metalworking knowledge, certainly spread across Europe, it wasn't always carried by the same genetic group. In some places, it was adopted by existing populations, but in Britain, that's where it gets really interesting. The genetic evidence indicates a nearly complete population replacement. The genetic markers of the Neolithic farmers, who had been in Britain for over 1,000 years, largely vanish, replaced by genetic signatures associated with the beaker culture originating from Central Europe. So while we might talk about the beaker people as a cultural package, in Britain they were a people genetically distinct from those who came before. Imagine the arrival: new boats, new faces, new language, new technologies. They weren't necessarily a conquering army in the traditional sense, but their arrival marked a profound demographic shift, perhaps through a combination of superior technology, different farming practices, or even disease. We don't have enough evidence to say for sure, but the impact was undeniable. These newcomers, arriving around 2500 BCE, brought with them not just copper, but also the knowledge of how to work it, how to extract it from the ground, how to melt it down and cast it into axes, daggers, and ornaments. And they brought something else: a desire for tin. This is where the true Bronze Age kicks in. Copper is okay, but add about 10% tin to it and you get bronze, a metal that is significantly harder, more durable, and holds a sharper edge. It's a game changer. But here's the rub. Copper is relatively widespread, but tin is rare. In Britain, the richest deposits are found in Cornwall, way down in the southwest. This geographic reality set the stage for one of the most remarkable transformations of ancient Britain: the rise of long-distance trade networks. Think about the logistical challenges. To make bronze, you need copper, likely sourced from Ireland or northern Wales, and tin from Cornwall. This wasn't just a casual exchange. This demanded organised mining, smelting, transportation, and specialised craftsmanship. Suddenly, the land that would become Britain, once a relative backwater in the grand scheme of continental trade, became a crucial hub. Its tin resources were highly prized across Europe. We imagine these early Bronze Age traders, perhaps in sturdy hide boats, navigating the coasts, exchanging raw ingots of tin for finished bronze tools, weapons, and exotic goods from the continent. Inland, river systems and ancient trackways would have been bustling with activity. These were not singular, isolated communities anymore. They were interconnected, part of a vast, intricate web of exchange that stretched across the Irish Sea, the English Channel, and deep into mainland Europe. With bronze came a new kind of society. The skills required to mine, smelt, and cast bronze were highly specialised. This led to the emergence of dedicated craftsmen, smiths, who held a unique and respected position. No longer could anyone just nap a flint axe. Now you needed the knowledge, the materials, and the tools of the smith. This specialisation fostered social stratification. Those who controlled the mines, those who controlled the trade routes, and those who possessed the skills to transform raw ore into gleaming objects of power and utility became the new elite. You see this reflected dramatically in their burials. Gone are the communal long barrows of the Neolithic. Instead, we find individual burials, often under distinctive round barrows or tumuli dotting the landscape. And what do we find inside? Rich grave goods, bronze daggers, axes, spearheads, often beautifully crafted. Sometimes even gold ornaments, like the spectacular gold lunulae crescent-shaped collars from Ireland, or the gold cups found in Wessex. These were not simply tools, they were symbols of status, power, and wealth. The deceased were being sent off with their most prized possessions, asserting their importance even in death. This new technology also transformed warfare. Bronze weapons, longer, sharper daggers, later true swords, and more effective spearheads made conflict more lethal and perhaps more frequent. The control of valuable resources like tin and copper and the trade routes that supplied them would have been ripe for dispute. We see evidence of this in the archaeological record. fortified enclosures, particularly later in the Bronze Age, hinting at a society where defence and conflict were growing concerns. And what about those grand monuments? The Neolithic people started them, but the Bronze Age people took them to a whole new level. Think of Stonehenge. Its earliest phases were Neolithic, but the iconic sarsen stones and the arrangement of the blue stones into the familiar circles, that was all Bronze Age. Imagine the sheer scale of the undertaking. The sarsen stones, weighing up to 50 tons, quarried from Marlborough Downs some 20 miles away, then dragged, shaped and erected using only ropes, levers and immense human effort. The blue stones, even more remarkably, were brought from the Preseli Hills in Wales, over 150 miles away. Why? Why go to such extraordinary lengths? We can only speculate, but it speaks to a highly organised society, capable of marshalling vast resources and labour. It suggests a deep religious or astronomical significance. Perhaps it was a temple to the sun, a celestial observatory, a place for healing, given the blue stone's perceived magical properties, or a powerful ancestral monument, reaffirming the legitimacy of the ruling elite. Whatever its precise purpose, Stonehenge, along with countless other stone circles and henges across Britain, tells us of a people deeply connected to their landscape, their cosmos, and their ancestors, expressing their beliefs through monumental architecture. Life in the Bronze Age wasn't just about metal and monuments, though. Most people lived in smaller round houses, clustered into hamlets or larger settlements. They continued to farm, growing cereals like wheat and barley, and raising livestock, cattle, sheep, goats and pigs. Hunting and gathering still supplemented their diets, especially in less arable areas. But the economy was becoming more complex, with specialised production and trade playing an increasingly vital role. Their beliefs were likely tied to the cycles of the sun and the moon, the fertility of the earth, and the power of water. We find bronze objects, often highly valuable, deliberately deposited in rivers and bogs, perhaps as offerings to deities or as a way to ritually remove items from circulation. The sun in particular seems to have been revered, reflected in gold objects and perhaps the alignments of stone circles. This vibrant, complex Bronze Age society flourished for well over a millennium, from around 2500 BC to about 800 BCE. It was a time of dynamic change, of increasing social complexity, and of Britain becoming a significant player in the wider European world. But, as with all ages, it eventually drew to a close. Around 1000 to 800 BCE, a combination of factors began to shift the landscape once more. There's evidence of climate change and a period of increased wetness and cooler temperatures, which would have stressed agricultural systems and potentially led to resource competition. Trade networks across Europe also began to change, perhaps disrupting the flow of tin and copper. And then there was the ultimate disruptor, the arrival of yet another new metal, iron. Iron is far more common than copper or tin, found almost everywhere, but it's much harder to work, requiring higher temperatures and different techniques. For a time, bronze and iron coexisted, but gradually iron's abundance and its eventual superiority for tools and weapons would win out. The transition wasn't a sudden cataclysmic event, but a gradual shift, a slow turning of the tide. The Bronze Age, with its gleaming weapons, its intricate trade routes, and its monumental stone circles, began to fade, making way for a new era. An era of iron, of hill forts, and of societies that would start to look a little more like the Celts we often mistakenly associate with all of the ancient Britain. But that, my friends, is a story for our next chapter. As the Bronze Age waned, its grand interconnected world of tin roots and monumental ambition slowly crumbled under the weight of changing climate and the relentless march of technological innovation. We left off with societies in flux, the great trading networks fragmenting, and those elaborate funeral rites for individual elites fading into memory. But here's the thing about history. It's not a neat, linear progression. It's more like a river, constantly carving new paths, sometimes drying up, sometimes flooding, always reshaping the landscape. And as one era receded, another, forged in a new, harder metal, was already beginning to take shape. Imagine yourself standing on a windswept hill around 800 BCE. The air is cooler, perhaps wetter than it was a few centuries prior. The great bronze swords and axes, once symbols of power and prestige, are becoming scarcer, their intricate designs giving way to something different. This is the dawn of the Iron Age in Britain, and it's a profound shift not just in metallurgy, but in the very fabric of society. Think about what bronze required: a complex supply chain for copper and, crucially, tin, often sourced from specific distant locations. This meant long-distance trade, specialized knowledge, and a hierarchical system to manage it all. Iron, however, was different. It was everywhere. Iron ore could be found in bogs, in shallow seams, almost underfoot in many places across Britain. But here's the kicker. It's much harder to work. Copper melts at around 1085 Dudeos. Tin at a mere 2 Iron, you need temperatures closer to 1500 Dudeos to really get it flowing. Or, more commonly in this period, a skilled smith using charcoal-fueled furnaces to heat and hammer it repeatedly, a process called blooming, to forge it into tools and weapons. This wasn't just a material change, it was an economic revolution. The reliance on distant specialized resources diminished. Suddenly, local communities could become more self-sufficient, extracting and working their own iron. This decentralized power in a way, but it also meant that the skills of the smith became even more vital, almost magical. We imagine these early ironworkers as figures of immense respect, shrouded in the smoke of their forges, transforming dull earth into sharp blades and sturdy plowshares. This shift from a bronze economy, which often favoured a few powerful elites controlling trade, to a more localised iron economy, where many communities could access the raw material, fundamentally altered the social landscape. As we move deeper into the Iron Age, roughly from 800 BC to the Roman arrival in 43 CE, one feature dominates the British landscape: hill forts. You cannot imagine Iron Age Britain without picturing these massive earthworks, crowning strategic hills, their ramparts rising like formidable waves against the sky. We're talking about hundreds, even thousands of them across the landmass. Why did they suddenly proliferate? Historians debate whether they were primarily defensive strongholds, economic centres, or perhaps even ceremonial gathering places. The truth, as always, is likely a complex blend of all three. Picture a hill fort like Maiden Castle in Dorset or Danebury in Hampshire. These weren't just simple palisades. They were monumental feats of engineering, multiple concentric rings of ditches and banks, sometimes reinforced with stone enclosing vast areas. Inside you'd find roundhouses, granaries, workshops, and sometimes even evidence of shrines. They represent a significant investment of communal labour and speak volumes about the emerging social structures. Life within these fortified settlements would have been bustling, a hub for farming, trade and communal living. We see evidence of increasingly organised agriculture, with fields carefully laid out and sophisticated storage techniques for grain, suggesting a growing population and a need for greater food security. This period also sees the crystallization of what we often, perhaps too broadly, refer to as Celtic culture in Britain. Now let's hit the brakes for a moment on that word. Here's the thing that blows my mind and often confuses people. There was no single unified Celtic people, empire, or political entity that swept across Europe. It's a linguistic and cultural umbrella term, first coined much later, to describe a diverse group of peoples who shared related languages, Proto-Celtic, certain artistic styles like the stunning Latin art with its whirling curvilinear designs, and some common religious practices. So that when we talk about Iron Age Britons as Celts, we're talking about a mosaic of distinct tribal groups, the Catuvelauni, the Iceni, the Durotriges, the Atrebates, and many more, who inhabited this landmass. They spoke various Brythonic Celtic languages, they shared aesthetic sensibilities, and they probably had similar social structures, but they were not a unified nation. They were often at odds with each other, forming alliances and engaging in skirmishes, much like their Bronze Age predecessors. The hill forts themselves could be seen as symbols of these distinct, often rivalrous tribal identities. What did daily life look like for these Iron Age Britons? It was still largely agrarian. People farmed cereals like wheat and barley, raised livestock, cattle, sheep, pigs, and supplemented their diet with hunting and foraging. But the iron tools made farming more efficient. Imagine the heavy rhythmic thud of an iron axe felling trees for construction, the glint of an iron ploughshare turning the soil, the sharp edge of an iron sickle harvesting grain. These were tough, resilient people living in roundhouses built of timber, wattle, and daub, with thatched roofs, often clustered together inside or just outside the hill forts. Their material culture was rich and distinctive. The Latin art style mentioned earlier is absolutely captivating. Think intricate patterns on metalwork, shield bosses, torques, neck rings, brooches, and even ornate mirrors. These weren't just functional items, they were statements of status, belief, and artistic prowess. The curvilinear motifs, often incorporating stylized animal and human forms, speak to a worldview deeply connected to nature and perhaps a sense of the flowing interconnectedness of life. We find these exquisite artifacts, sometimes deliberately broken or deposited in rivers and bogs as votive offerings, hinting at a complex spiritual world. And what about that spiritual world? While direct evidence is scarce until Roman accounts, we know that religion was deeply woven into the fabric of Iron Age life. We imagine sacred groves, veneration of natural forces, and perhaps the guidance of figures like the druids, who later Roman writers would describe as powerful priests, judges, and teachers. The practice of placing valuable objects, weapons, jewellery, even human remains, in bogs and rivers suggests a profound belief in the spiritual power of these liminal spaces, acting as gateways to other realms. Think of the chillingly well-preserved bog bodies found in similar contexts in continental Europe, offering a hauntingly direct connection to these ancient rituals. As we move closer to the 1st century BCE, we see some of these Iron Age tribes becoming more centralized, almost proto-states, particularly in the southeast of Britain. They minted their own coins, often crude but distinctive copies of continental Celtic or even Roman designs, indicating increasing trade and interaction with mainland Europe. The Channel was a bustling highway, not a barrier, carrying goods, ideas and people between Britain and Gaul, modern-day France. It's this diverse, dynamic and often fragmented collection of Iron Age peoples that Julius Caesar would encounter in 55 and 54 BCE. He wasn't arriving in a unified Britain to conquer a singular Britain. He was sailing to an island inhabited by a patchwork of the independent, sometimes allied, sometimes warring tribal confederations. His brief forays would offer the first written, albeit biased, accounts of these societies, painting a picture of formidable warriors, complex social structures, and a land rich in resources. The Iron Age, then, was not a period of stagnation but of profound development. It saw the rise of iconic landscapes dotted with hill forts, the flowering of a distinctive artistic tradition, and the establishment of complex, if localized, societies. It was an era defined by resilience, ingenuity, and a deep connection to the land and its resources. And it was this vibrant, fiercely independent world that was about to collide with the greatest empire the Western world had ever known, setting the stage for yet another transformative chapter in the story of this ever-changing island. The Romans were coming, and Britain, as it had done so many times before, was about to be irrevocably reshaped. The Iron Age tribes, as we left them, were a vibrant, complex tapestry of peoples, each with their own chieftains, customs, and rivalries. They were adapting, trading, fighting amongst themselves, and in some cases, even minting their own coins, signalling a growing sophistication. They were, in short, on the cusp of something new, but they couldn't have imagined the seismic shift that was about to hit their world. Because, you see, across the narrow stretch of water that was once Doggerland, a different kind of empire was flexing its muscles, an empire that had already consumed much of the known world: Rome. Julius Caesar, that ambitious general we mentioned, made his first tentative forays into Britain in 55 and 54 BCE. Now here's the thing that often gets misunderstood. These weren't full-blown invasions designed for conquest. Think of them more as reconnaissance missions, punitive raids, and, let's be honest, a massive ego boost for Caesar himself. He'd just conquered Gaul, and he needed new lands, new peoples to subdue to keep his legions busy and his political star shining. He claimed he was stopping the Britons from aiding their Gallic cousins in resistance against him, and there was some truth to that. But mostly it was about showing off. Look what I can do. I can even cross the ocean to this mysterious misty island. His first attempt in 55 BCE was a bit of a disaster, honestly. He landed with 2 legions, but the fierce resistance from the local tribes, combined with the severe storm that wrecked much of his fleet, forced a hasty retreat. He learned a few lessons, though. The next year, 54 BC, he returned with a much larger force, 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry, over 20,000 men, and this time he pushed further inland. He even managed to defeat Cassivellaunus, a powerful chieftain of the Catuvellauni, and extract tribute. But the victory was fleeting. Caesar had bigger fish to fry back in Rome, so he left no permanent garrisons, no lasting Roman presence. He simply extracted promises of tribute, established a few client relationships, and then departed, leaving Britain to its own devices once more. So, what was the impact? Well, for the Britons, it was a terrifying glimpse into a future they couldn't possibly comprehend. They had faced a military machine unlike anything they had ever encountered. Highly disciplined legions, superior engineering, siege weapons. They fought bravely, fiercely, but they were outmatched in organization and technology. It was a wake-up call, but it also proved that Britain wasn't easily conquered. Caesar's expeditions, while ultimately unsuccessful in establishing Roman rule, did pull Britain further into Rome's orbit. For the next century, the island was known to Rome, a place of mystery and potential resources, but also a place of fierce, independent tribes. This period between Caesar's departure in 54 BCE and the full-scale invasion in 43 CE is fascinating. We often call it the Lost Century or the Client Kingdom period. It wasn't a static time, far from it. The tribes of southeastern Britain particularly began to interact more and more with the Roman world. Trade flourished. Roman goods, wine, pottery, luxury items flowed into Britain, and British slaves, metals, and agricultural products flowed out. Some tribal leaders like Cunobelinus, the Cymbeline of Shakespeare fame, even adopted aspects of Roman culture, minted coins with Latin inscriptions, and fostered political alliances with Rome. They became client kings, maintaining their power through Roman patronage, creating a complex web of diplomacy and intrigue. But this Romanization was a double-edged sword. While it brought new wealth and ideas, it also created internal divisions. Some tribes or factions within tribes embraced the Roman connection, seeing it as a path to power and prosperity. Others fiercely resisted, clinging to their traditional ways and resenting the growing foreign influence. This internal strife, these existing rivalries and political fault lines, would prove crucial when Rome finally decided to commit to a full conquest. And conquer they did. The year is 43 CE. Nearly a century after Caesar's abortive attempts, the Emperor Claudius, a man eager to prove himself and secure his position, saw Britain as the perfect opportunity. He needed a military triumph, a new province to add to the empire, and perhaps some of those fabled British resources: tin, lead, grain, slaves. He launched a massive invasion, far larger and more determined than anything Caesar had attempted. 4 legions, around 40,000 men, plus auxiliaries, cavalry and even elephants, yes, elephants, landed on the shores of Kent. Can you imagine the sheer terror and awe of the Britons witnessing these colossal beasts, symbols of Roman might, disembarking onto their beaches? It must have been utterly mind-blowing. The initial invasion, led by Aulus Plautius, met with fierce resistance, but the Roman war machine was relentless. They pushed inland, establishing a bridgehead, fighting their way across rivers, and eventually cornering the formidable Caratacus, leader of the Catuvelauni, the son of Cunobelinus, who had rallied several tribes against them. Claudius himself even made a brief theatrical appearance in Britain to preside over the capture of Camulodunum, modern Colchester, which became the first capital of the new Roman province. But the conquest was not a swift, clean affair. Oh no, it was a brutal, drawn-out process that would take decades. Caratacus, a brilliant guerrilla leader, continued to harry the Romans for years, retreating westward into Wales, rallying other tribes like the Siluras and Ordovixes, before finally being betrayed and captured in 51 CE. He was paraded through Rome, a testament to Roman power, but his defiant speech before the Emperor Claudius reportedly saved his life. The true fury of British resistance, however, erupted in 60-61 CE. This is where we meet Boudica, Queen of the Iceni. Her story is one of the most famous and most tragic in British history. The Iceni, a client kingdom in what is now East Anglia, had initially allied with Rome, but upon the death of their king, Prasutagus, the Romans, in a shocking display of imperial arrogance and brutality, ignored his will, seized his lands, publicly flogged Boudica, and raped her daughters. The sheer injustice ignited a firestorm. Boudica, a formidable warrior queen described as tall, with long red hair and a piercing gaze, rallied not only the Iceni but also the neighbouring Trinovantes and other disgruntled tribes. What followed was an explosion of vengeance. Boudica's forces swept through the Roman settlements, utterly destroying Camulodunum, Londinium, London, and Verulamium, St. Albans. The Roman garrisons were massacred, the settlers slaughtered. The scale of the destruction was immense, and the Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was caught off guard. He'd been campaigning in North Wales, attempting to crush the Druidic heartland on Anglesey, when the revolt erupted. He raced back, gathered his forces, and finally confronted Boudica's vast but less disciplined army in a decisive battle at an unknown location, likely somewhere in the Midlands. The Roman legions, with their superior training, tactics and equipment, inflicted a crushing defeat. Tens of thousands of Britons were killed. Boudica, rather than be captured, is believed to have taken poison. Her rebellion, while ultimately a failure, sent a clear message: Britain would not be easily tamed. The decades that followed saw the slow, methodical expansion of Roman control. Governors like Gnaeus Julius Agricola, arriving in 7 CE, pushed the frontiers further north, establishing forts, building roads, and even attempting to conquer Caledonia, Scotland. He secured much of what would become England and Wales, but the wild tribes of the Scottish Highlands proved too resilient, too difficult to subdue permanently. By the early 2nd century CE, the Emperor Hadrian, recognizing the limits of Roman power, ordered the construction of a monumental barrier across northern England, Hadrian's Wall. This wasn't just a defensive fortification. It was a statement, a clear demarcation between the Romanized world and the unconquered barbarian lands. Later, another, shorter wall, the Antonine Wall, was built further north, but it was eventually abandoned. Hadrian's Wall became the permanent, iconic northern frontier of Roman Britain. So what did Roman rule mean for the indigenous peoples of Britain? It meant profound, irreversible transformation. For nearly 4 centuries, from 43 CE to the early 5th century CE, Britain was a Roman province. The landscape was reshaped. A vast network of straight, well-engineered roads crisscrossed the country, connecting military forts with burgeoning towns. These towns, like Londinium, Eboracum, York, and Deva Victrix, Chester, became centres of administration, trade, and Roman culture, complete with forums, basilicas, public baths, temples, and amphitheatres. Agriculture was intensified, often geared towards supplying the Roman army and exporting grain to the continent. Mining of lead, iron, copper, and tin flourished, making Britain a vital resource hub for the empire. Villas, grand country estates with underfloor heating, mosaics and Roman architectural styles spread across the countryside, owned by wealthy Britons who had adopted Roman ways or by Roman officials and settlers. This process, known as Romanization, wasn't forced upon everyone at sword point. While the military presence was undeniable, especially in the north and west, many Britons willingly adopted Roman custom, language, Latin, and even gods. They saw the benefits: peace, stability, economic opportunity, and access to Roman amenities and social structures. For ambitious Britons, becoming a Roman citizen or achieving status within the Roman system was a clear path to power and prestige. We see evidence of this hybrid culture everywhere: tombstones with Latin inscriptions for native Britons, mosaics depicting classical myths alongside local deities, and a general blending of styles in art and architecture. But let's be clear, Romanization was not uniform. It was strongest in the lowlands south and east, where the towns and villas were concentrated. Here, a Romano-British elite emerged, fluent in Latin, wearing togas, and participating in Roman civic life. In the more rugged north and west, particularly in Wales and beyond Hadrian's Wall, the old tribal structures and Celtic languages persisted with far less Roman overlay. This divide between the Romanized heartland and the more traditional militarized frontiers would shape the future of Britain for centuries to come. Britain became a frontier province, heavily militarized, a place where legions were stationed, and where the constant threat of barbarian raids from the north and sea raiders from the east demanded a strong Roman presence. It was a land of diverse peoples: indigenous Britons, Roman soldiers from across the empire, traders from Gaul and beyond, administrators and settlers. They lived, worked, and died together, forging a new, complex identity that was neither purely Roman nor purely Iron Age British, but something new altogether, and for almost 400 years, this was the reality. But as we know, no empire lasts forever, and the story of Roman Britain, like all stories, has an ending, one that would plunge the island back into an age of uncertainty and profound change. And so, for nearly 4 centuries, the land we now call Britain was a Roman province. 400 years! Think about that for a moment. That's longer than the United States has been a nation. It's a span of time that saw cities rise, roads crisscross the land, villas dot the countryside, and a hybrid Romano-British culture take root, especially in the lowland southeast. Hadrian's Wall stood as a monumental testament to Roman ambition and perhaps a growing sense of vulnerability. It was a time of relative stability, of law, of commerce, and of a shared, if imposed, identity. But here's the thing that always blows my mind about history. Nothing, absolutely nothing, is permanent. Empires like glaciers and sea levels rise and fall. The Roman Empire, for all its might and sophistication, was no exception. It was a vast, sprawling entity constantly battling internal strife, economic pressures, and external threats across its immense borders. Britain, while a valuable province, was also a frontier, a distant outpost requiring significant military investment. And as the heart of the empire began to falter, the extremities felt the strain most acutely. By the late 3rd and into the 4th century CE, you could start to see the cracks forming in the Roman edifice in Britain. The economy, once robust, began to struggle. The imperial mints, once churning out stable coinage, started debasing their currency, leading to inflation and economic instability. Trade routes, once secure, became riskier. And then there were the raids. Oh, the raids. From the north, the Picts, those painted warriors beyond Hadrian's Wall, became ever more aggressive. From across the Irish Sea, the Soti, a name that would later come to define the people of Scotland, but who were then raiders from Ireland, harried the western coasts. And from the east, across the tempestuous North Sea, came a new, increasingly formidable threat. Germanic peoples, often lumped together as Saxons, though they included Angles, Jutes and others, sailing their longships in search of plunder. To counter these seaborne threats, the Romans built a chain of impressive fortifications along the southeastern coast, stretching from Norfolk down to Hampshire. We call these the Saxon shore forts, and their very existence tells us a story of an empire on the defensive, of a frontier under constant pressure. They were formidable structures, yes, but they were also a clear sign that the Roman grip was loosening. Now, let's fast forward to the early 5th century CE. The Roman Empire was in crisis. Its legions were stretched thin, fighting wars on multiple fronts, against Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, closer to Rome itself. Britain, though far away, became a tempting source of manpower for ambitious generals. In 407 CE, a Roman general named Constantine III, who had been proclaimed emperor by his troops in Britain, pulled a significant portion of the remaining Roman legions from the island. He took them across the Channel to Gaul, hoping to make his claim to the imperial throne stick. Spoiler alert, it didn't work out for him. But his actions left Britain dangerously exposed. Think about this, for nearly 400 years, the military backbone of Britain had been the Roman army. Now, a huge chunk of that protection was gone, not to defend Britain, but to fight continental power struggles. Then came the year 410 CE, a date that echoes through history. The Visigoths sacked Rome itself, an unthinkable blow to the empire's prestige and power. The Emperor Honorius, besieged by problems closer to home, sent a letter known as the Rescript of Honorius to the Civitates, the local Roman administrative centres in Britain. The message was stark, chillingly direct. Look to your own defence. And just like that, the Roman era in Britain was, officially, unofficially, over. But let's be clear, this wasn't a sudden, dramatic fall like a brick wall collapsing. It was more like a slow, inexorable unravelling, a thread gradually pulling apart. The legions were gone, yes, but Roman institutions didn't vanish overnight. The Romano-British elite, those who had benefited most from Roman rule, tried to maintain some semblance of order. They tried to organise defences, collect taxes, and keep the infrastructure running. But without the central authority, without the disciplined legions, it was a losing battle. What happened next is often called the Dark Ages, not because nothing happened, but because our written records become incredibly scarce. It's a period of profound uncertainty and fragmentation. The grand villas were abandoned, their mosaics crumbling, their hypocausts growing cold. The cities, once bustling centres of commerce and administration, began to shrink, their public buildings falling into disrepair. Pottery production, a key indicator of economic activity, largely ceased. The sophisticated Roman road network, while still there, was no longer maintained. It was a slow, grinding descent into a more localised, less interconnected world. Imagine being a Romano-Briton during this time. Your world, which had been part of a vast, ordered empire, was suddenly thrown into chaos. The familiar safety nets were gone, raids from the Picts, Scotti and Saxons intensified. You were on your own, and those Saxons from the east? They weren't just raiders anymore. They were looking for something more permanent. For decades, some Germanic warriors had already been serving as foederati, federated troops, essentially mercenaries, for the Romans in Britain, guarding the very Saxon shore forts that had been built to keep their kin out. It's a deeply ironic twist of fate, isn't it? The traditional story, recorded centuries later, tells of a desperate Romano-British leader named Vortigern, who in his struggle against the Picts invited two Jutish chieftains, Hengist and Horsa, to settle in Kent as mercenaries around the mid-5th century. They did their job, but then, seeing the weakness of their hosts and the richness of the land, they invited more of their people, and more, and more. This narrative, while probably heavily mythologized, captures a fundamental truth. The arrival of Germanic peoples wasn't a single invasion, but a protracted process of migration, settlement, and conflict. What followed was a period of intense cultural and demographic upheaval. Waves of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, along with Frisians and other groups, crossed the North Sea. They brought with them their own languages, their own gods, their own social structures, and their own farming practices. They weren't just conquering elites, they were settlers, planting roots, clearing land, and establishing new communities. The archaeological evidence from this period is fascinating and at times stark. We see a clear shift in material culture, distinct Anglo-Saxon pottery, different styles of houses, and perhaps most strikingly, different burial practices. Rich grave goods, often weapons and elaborate jewellery, tell us about the emerging warrior aristocracy of these new peoples. Place names too begin to change, replacing the Latin and Brythonic, ancestor of Welsh, names with Old English names that still echo in our landscape today. This process was not peaceful. It involved conflict, displacement, and the gradual, often violent establishment of new Germanic kingdoms across what would eventually become England. We speak of the Heptarchy, the 7 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. But this was a fluid and constantly shifting political landscape. So what happened to the Romano-Britons? This is where the story gets really poignant and, frankly, a little heartbreaking. Some undoubtedly stayed in the newly forming Anglo-Saxon areas, eventually assimilating, their descendants speaking Old English rather than Latin or Brythonic. We know this happened because genetic studies show a continuity of population, though with significant shifts. Others, however, resisted. They retreated to the west, to the rugged, defensible hills of what would become Wales, Cornwall and Cumbria. Some even migrated across the Channel to Armorica, which became Brittany, carrying their culture and language with them. It's in this crucible of resistance and retreat that the legends of King Arthur were forged. Forget the shining armour and the Round Table for a moment. The historical Arthur, if he existed, was likely a Romano-British war leader, a Dux Bellorum, who rallied the fragmented British forces against the encroaching Anglo-Saxons in the late 5th or early 6th century. He represented the last gasp of a dying world, a desperate attempt to preserve a British way of life against overwhelming odds. His story, passed down through generations, became a powerful symbol of resistance and hope, a memory of a time when the Britons fought back. But ultimately the tide of history was against them. The linguistic and cultural map of Britain was fundamentally redrawn. The East and South became Anglo-Saxon, their language evolving into Old English, laying the foundation for modern English. The West remained British, preserving their Brythonic languages, which would eventually become Welsh, Cornish and Breton. The Roman era had ended, not with a bang but with a complex, drawn-out transformation. The unified, albeit Romanized province shattered into a patchwork of competing entities. The ancient Britain of Roman times, a figure already complex and diverse, was now further fractured, either assimilated into a new Anglo-Saxon identity or pushed to the western fringes, where a distinct, resilient British culture would continue to endure. And so, as the 6th century dawned, the land was no longer Roman Britain. It was becoming something new, something profoundly different. It was a land of emerging kingdoms, of new languages, new gods, and new identities. The stage was set for the next grand act in this epic story of constant change. A story that reminds us that even the most enduring structures eventually crumble, making way for the utterly unexpected. The last chapter left us in a truly chaotic, fragmented Britain, a land grappling with the ghost of Rome and the very real, very present reality of Anglo-Saxon migration. The legends of Arthur, those poignant tales of Romano-British resistance, were born from this maelstrom, a desperate clinging to a fading world. But history, my friends, never stands still. The tides of change kept rolling in, and what emerged from that tumultuous period was a new landscape, a new identity, and a new set of challenges that would define Britain for centuries to come. We saw the Romano-Britons pushed west, their Brythonic languages and traditions retreating into the strongholds of Wales, Cornwall and Strathclyde. Meanwhile, the Anglo-Saxons, those Germanic newcomers, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, weren't just raiding anymore. They were settling, planting roots, and establishing their own distinct societies across what would become England. This wasn't some overnight conquest, but a slow grinding process of displacement, assimilation, and the carving out of new territories. Think of it less as a single decisive battle and more like a cultural and demographic creep, a gradual reshaping of the very fabric of the land. Here's the thing that often gets overlooked. These Anglo-Saxons didn't arrive as a unified force with a single grand plan. Oh no. They were diverse groups, often rivals, each seeking to establish their own dominance. And over the next few centuries, roughly from the 6th to the 9th, these myriad settlements began to coalesce into distinct kingdoms. You've probably heard of them, even if the names sometimes blur together. Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Kent, Essex, Sussex. We call this period the Heptarchy, meaning rule of 7, though the number and influence of these kingdoms constantly shifted. It was less a fixed set of 7 and more a dynamic, often brutal Game of Thrones, where one kingdom would rise to temporary supremacy, only to be challenged and eventually supplanted by another. Imagine for a moment a map of Britain during this era. Forget the neat modern county lines. Instead, picture a patchwork quilt of competing powers, each with its own king, its own warrior elite, its own distinct dialect and customs, though all broadly Anglo-Saxon. Northumbria, stretching from the Humber up into what is now southern Scotland, was often a cultural and military powerhouse in the north. Mercia, in the Midlands, was a formidable force, particularly under powerful kings like Offa, who even built a massive earthwork, Offa's Dyke, along the border with Wales, a clear demarcation of power, a monumental statement that still exists today. Down in the southwest, Wessex, which would eventually rise to dominate them all. Life in these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was, by our modern standards, harsh and agrarian. Most people lived in small, scattered villages, working the land, raising livestock and living in timber-framed halls. Society was hierarchical, with kings at the top, supported by their warrior retinues, thanes or earls, followed by freemen, and then a significant population of slaves, often captured Britons or those who had fallen into debt. The focus was on loyalty, kinship and military prowess. Raiding was still a common activity, not just against the remaining Britons, but also between rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. This was a world where a strong king was vital for survival and prosperity, a protector and a dispenser of justice and wealth. Now, let's talk about something truly transformative, a force that would profoundly reshape Anglo-Saxon Britain: Christianity. You see, while Roman Britain had been Christianized, that faith had largely receded with the legions, pushed west with the Romano-Britons. The Anglo-Saxons arrived with their own pantheon of gods: Woden, Thunor, Thor, Frigg, whose names still echo in our days of the week. But Christianity wasn't entirely gone. It had flourished in Ireland and Scotland, a vibrant monastic Celtic Christianity that was distinct in many ways from the Roman tradition. Here's where it gets fascinating. The re-Christianization of England wasn't a single event, but a dual movement, a pincer movement of faith. From the south, in 597 CE, Pope Gregory the Great dispatched a monk named Augustine to Kent, then ruled by King Ethelbert. Ethelbert's Frankish wife Bertha was already Christian, which certainly smoothed the way. Augustine established his mission in Canterbury, and soon the king and many of his people were baptized. This was the start of the Roman tradition taking root in England. But from the north, another powerful wave of Christianity was spreading. Monks from the Irish monastery of Iona, founded by Saint Columba, brought their Celtic brand of Christianity to Northumbria. Figures like Aidan, invited by King Oswald, established the monastery of Lindisfarne, a beacon of learning and spirituality. So you had two distinct forms of Christianity, Roman and Celtic, spreading through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, often side by side, sometimes in gentle competition. Think about this: two different ways of calculating Easter, different monastic tonsures, haircuts for monks, and different organisational structures. This wasn't just theological nitpicking, it was about authority and identity. The Roman Church was hierarchical, centred on the Pope, emphasising uniform practices. The Celtic Church was more decentralised, rooted in powerful monastic communities. Eventually, these differences came to a head at the Synod of Whitby in 64 CE. King Oswiu of Northumbria convened this council to decide which tradition his kingdom would follow. In the end, the arguments for the Roman tradition, particularly its direct lineage to St. Peter and thus to Christ, won the day. This was a pivotal moment, aligning England firmly with the wider European Roman Church and setting a course for greater continental integration. The impact of Christianity on Anglo-Saxon society was immense. It brought literacy, not just for religious texts, but for administration and law. Monasteries became centres of learning, art and craft, preserving knowledge, and producing stunning works like the Lindisfarne Gospels, an illuminated manuscript that is, frankly, breathtaking. We're talking about a level of artistic sophistication and spiritual devotion that truly blows my mind, especially considering the often brutal context of the times. It fostered a sense of shared identity, gradually unifying the disparate Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under a common faith, even as they continued to squabble for political dominance. The 8th century in particular saw a cultural and intellectual flourishing, especially in Northumbria, often referred to as the Northumbrian Renaissance. This was the age of Bede, often called the father of English history, whose ecclesiastical history of the English people is our primary source for much of this period. Imagine a world where a single monk, writing in a remote monastery, could compile such a comprehensive and influential historical account. It's a testament to the power of literacy in the monastic tradition. As the centuries progressed, the balance of power among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms continued to shift. Northumbria's golden age eventually waned, and Mercia rose to prominence, culminating in the reign of Offa, 757-796 CE, whose influence was so great that Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor, treated him as an equal, but even Mercia's dominance was temporary. By the early 9th century, Wessex began its ascent, a process that would become critically important when a new terrifying threat emerged from across the sea. We're talking, of course, about the Vikings. Now, if you thought the Anglo-Saxon migrations were disruptive, prepare yourself for something else entirely. The date 793 CE is burned into the memory of British history, the raiding of the monastery at Lindisfarne. Imagine the scene, a peaceful, wealthy monastic community, a beacon of Christian learning and art, suddenly assaulted by longships filled with fierce, pagan warriors from Scandinavia. This wasn't just a raid, it was a psychological shockwave. It signalled the beginning of a new era, the Viking Age, a period of relentless incursions that would once again reshape the political, social, and even genetic landscape of Britain. Let's start with the obvious question nobody asks: why the Vikings? Well, several factors were at play. Population growth in Scandinavia, improvements in shipbuilding technology, those longships were engineering marvels, and perhaps a desire for wealth and land. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, with their rich monasteries and burgeoning towns, were ripe targets. They were also often internally divided, making them vulnerable. Initially, the Viking attacks were hit-and-run raids, smash, grab and disappear back across the North Sea. Monasteries, being wealthy and poorly defended, were prime targets, but over time the nature of these incursions changed. By the mid-9th century, what started as seasonal raiding evolved into something far more ambitious. In 885 CE, a massive force, known to the Anglo-Saxons as the Great Heathen Army, landed in East Anglia. This was no mere raiding party, this was an army of conquest and settlement. Think about the sheer terror and devastation this army unleashed. Kingdom after kingdom fell. East Anglia, Northumbria and Mercia were overwhelmed. Their kings were killed, their lands ravaged, their population subjected to new rulers and new laws. The great heathen army spent years campaigning across England, wintering in conquered territories, establishing strongholds, and eventually settling. This led to the formation of the Danelaw, a large area of eastern and northern England where Danish law and custom prevailed. Here's the thing that blows my mind about this period. Just when it seemed like Anglo-Saxon England was on the verge of complete collapse, one kingdom, Wessex, managed to hold out, and one king in particular would rise to meet this existential threat. We'll dive into his story and the incredible resilience of a people facing utter destruction in our next chapter. But for now, understand that the arrival of the Vikings wasn't just another chapter in the story of Britain. It was a seismic event that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the island, setting the stage for a new kind of Anglo-Saxon identity forged in the crucible of conflict and cultural exchange. The land of the Britons, the Romans and the Anglo-Saxons was about to get a whole lot more complicated and a whole lot more fascinating. Okay, so we left off with a truly terrifying picture, didn't we? The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, once so proud and increasingly sophisticated, were being systematically dismantled. The great heathen army, this relentless, almost unstoppable force, had swept across Northumbria, East Anglia and Mercia. They weren't just raiding anymore, they were settling, establishing their own laws and customs in what would become known as the Danelaw. Imagine the sheer panic, the despair that must have gripped the Anglo-Saxon populace. Their kings were either dead in exile or reduced to puppet rulers. Monasteries, centres of learning and wealth lay in ruins. It felt, for all intents and purposes, like the end of Anglo-Saxon England. And then there was Wessex. Wessex, the last bastion, the final desperate hope. It stood, bruised and battered, but remarkably still standing, and at its head a young king, barely out of his 20s, inherited this seemingly impossible task. His name, Alfred. Now, before we dive into the legend, let's get real for a moment. We often think of figures like Alfred as born great, destined for glory. But here's the thing that blows my mind. Alfred wasn't just handed a kingdom, he inherited a catastrophe. He was a man thrust into an almost unwinnable situation, facing an enemy that had demonstrated its ability to conquer virtually everything in its path. Picture this. A young man, probably feeling the immense weight of his entire people's survival on his shoulders, watching his kingdom shrink, his forces dwindle, and the Viking longships relentlessly pressing in. His early years on the throne were frankly a disaster. The Vikings, led by formidable figures like Guthrum, were relentless. They launched surprise attacks, broke treaties, and pushed Alfred and his forces to the brink. There were moments, many of them, where it seemed Wessex too would fall. In fact, it almost did. In 1878 CE, after a devastating winter campaign by Guthrum, Alfred was forced to abandon his court and flee. He became essentially a fugitive king, hiding in the marshlands of Athelney and Somerset. Think about that for a second. The king of the last free Anglo-Saxon kingdom, reduced to a desperate, almost solitary existence, scrambling for survival in the mud and reeds. It's a stark, humanizing image, isn't it? It's during this period, by the way, that the famous story of Alfred burning the cakes comes from. A potentially apocryphal tale, yes, but one that speaks volumes about his vulnerable, disguised state. He was just another refugee, albeit a royal one, relying on the kindness or ignorance of strangers. But here's where Alfred truly begins to earn his epithet, the Great. He didn't just hide, he used this time to regroup, to strategize, and to think. From his marshland redoubt he began to organize a resistance. He sent messengers, rallied loyal eldermen and Thegans, and slowly, painstakingly began to rebuild his forces. This wasn't just about military might, it was about resilience, about leadership in the face of utter despair. What Alfred realised and what sets him apart was that the old ways of fighting weren't working. The traditional Anglo-Saxon feared a citizen army called up for short periods was too slow, too disorganised, and too easily outmanoeuvred by the swift professional Viking warriors. So Alfred innovated. He reformed the feared, dividing it into two halves, ensuring that one half was always on active duty while the other managed their farms. This meant he always had a standing, trained army ready to respond. This was a game changer. But he didn't stop there. He understood the importance of defence. He initiated a vast programme of building fortified towns, known as burghs. These weren't just castles, they were planned settlements, strategically placed to defend key routes and territories. Each burgh was designed to be easily defended, with a permanent garrison drawn from the surrounding landowners, who were responsible for its upkeep. This network of burghs provided sanctuaries for the population, bases for Alfred's armies, and economic hubs that helped to stabilise his kingdom. It was an incredibly ambitious project, and it fundamentally reshaped the landscape of Wessex. And let's not forget the sea. The Vikings, after all, arrived by ship. Alfred, recognising this, also began to develop a navy. We're not talking about modern battleships here, but purpose-built longships designed to counter the Viking vessels. It was an early, crucial step in asserting control over the seas around Britain. So picture it, a king who just months earlier was a hunted man in the swamps, had now orchestrated a fundamental overhaul of his kingdom's military and defensive infrastructure. It was an astonishing feat of strategic planning and sheer political will. By the spring of 878 CE, Alfred was ready. He emerged from Athelney, gathering his forces from Somerset, Wiltshire and Hampshire. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes a joyous reunion, a surge of hope as the king returned to lead his people. They marched to meet Guthrum's army at Edington. The Battle of Edington was, without exaggeration, one of the most pivotal moments in early English history. It was a brutal, hard-fought engagement. For an entire day, the Anglo-Saxon shield wall held firm against the Viking onslaught, but Alfred's reformed army, disciplined and motivated, eventually broke the Viking lines. It was a decisive victory. Guthrum and his remaining forces were trapped and besieged. The terms of surrender were extraordinary. Guthrum, the fearsome Viking warlord who had brought England to its knees, agreed to be baptized as a Christian, with Alfred himself standing as his godfather. Can you imagine the symbolic weight of that moment? The vanquished pagan leader embracing the faith of his conqueror. It was a political masterstroke, securing a peace that for a time would hold. This victory led directly to the Treaty of Wedmore, though it may have been a series of agreements, often referred to by this name. This treaty formalised the division of England. Guthrum and his Danes would rule the east and north, the Danelaw, while Alfred would rule Wessex and what remained of Mercia not under Danish control. It wasn't a complete reclamation, not by any stretch, but it secured the survival of an independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom and established clear boundaries. It was, in essence, the birth certificate of two distinct entities on the island, a Danish-ruled east and an Anglo-Saxon west. But Alfred's legacy extends far beyond his military triumphs. He wasn't just a warrior king, he was a scholar king, a visionary. He understood that simply surviving wasn't enough. His kingdom needed to thrive culturally and intellectually. The Viking raids had devastated monasteries, wiping out centres of learning and literacy. Alfred saw this as a profound threat to the very fabric of his society. So he embarked on an ambitious programme of educational reform. He lamented the decline of Latin scholarship and the lack of literacy even among his own clergy. He ordered the translation of important Latin works, including Bede's Ecclesiastical History, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, and Pope Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care into Old English. He didn't just commission these translations, he participated in them, reportedly translating some himself. He also encouraged the writing of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a vital primary source that gives us so much of what we know about this period. Here's the thing about this. It wasn't just about preserving knowledge, it was about making it accessible. By translating these works into the vernacular, Alfred was laying the groundwork for a literate, educated populace, and crucially, elevating Old English as a language of serious scholarship and governance. He was fostering a shared cultural identity, a sense of Englishness that transcended individual kingdoms. He also reformed the legal system, issuing a comprehensive law code that synthesized existing West Saxon laws with those of Kent and Mercia, attempting to create a more unified legal framework. This further cemented his authority and provided a clearer, more equitable system of justice. What Alfred achieved then was nothing short of miraculous. He didn't just save Wessex, he laid the foundations for a unified English kingdom. He cultivated a vision of Engla land, the land of the Angles, a concept that, while not fully realized in his lifetime, would inspire his successors. He transformed a fragmented, beleaguered society into a resilient, organized, and culturally vibrant entity. He was in many ways the architect of England as we know it. His death in 899 CE left a kingdom far stronger and more secure than the one he had inherited. He had not expelled the Vikings entirely, no, but he had contained them, negotiated with them, and crucially, established a framework for future Anglo-Saxon kings to begin the long, arduous process of reclaiming the Danelaw. And that, my friends, is exactly what his successors would set out to do. The stage was set for a century of conflict and consolidation as the House of Wessex, emboldened by Alfred's legacy, began to push back against the Danish presence, slowly, deliberately, forging a truly unified English kingdom out of the crucible of Viking invasion. The Dark Ages were still dark, yes, but a beacon had been lit, a path forged towards something new, something that would eventually be called England. All right, so we left off with King Alfred, a man who stared into the abyss of Viking conquest and, against all odds, pulled his kingdom back from the brink. He died in 899 CE, leaving behind not just a stronger Wessex, but a vision, a blueprint for something bigger, something we might even call England. His reforms, his buck network, his legal codes, his educational push, they weren't just about survival, they were about laying the foundations for a unified, literate, and self-aware society. And honestly, isn't that just mind-blowing? To think of a king facing such existential threat still having the foresight to plan for generations, but a vision is just a vision without someone to carry it forward. And here's where the story gets really compelling, because Alfred's children and grandchildren were absolutely up to the task. His son, Edward the Elder, who reigned from 809 to 924 CE, didn't just inherit a kingdom, he inherited a crusade, and he prosecuted it with relentless methodical efficiency. Think of him as the guy who meticulously follows the instruction manual his genius dad wrote, but then adds a few brilliant upgrades of his own. Edward's strategy was simple, yet devastatingly effective. Push the Burh network further north and east, reclaiming territory from the Danelaw piece by piece, consolidating control, and then building another Burh to secure it. It was like a slow, inexorable tide of Anglo-Saxon power washing over the Viking settlements. But Edward wasn't alone in this monumental effort. And here's where we meet one of the most remarkable and often overlooked figures in early English history, his sister, Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians. Seriously, If you're looking for a historical figure to root for, Ethelfled is it. When her husband, Ethelred, the Ealdorman of Mercia, died in 911 CE, she didn't just retreat into widowhood. She stepped up, taking direct control of Mercia, a kingdom that was still very much on the front lines against the Vikings. She built burhs of her own, places like Tamworth and Stafford, often coordinating her campaigns with her brother Edward. She was a military commander, a diplomat, and a ruler in her own right, earning the respect of her enemies and the loyalty of her people. She even campaigned against the Welsh. She was, for all intents and purposes, a queen, even if the title wasn't formally hers. Imagine a woman leading armies and fortifying towns in the early 10th century. It's an incredible testament to her strength and capability, and a reminder that history is full of fascinating characters who defy our modern assumptions about their times. Together, Edward and Ethelfled systematically dismantled the Danelaw. By the time Ethelfled died in 918 CE, and Edward briefly absorbed Mercia into Wessex, and Edward himself in 924 CE, most of England south of the Humber was back under Anglo-Saxon control. They had done the heavy lifting, but the final dramatic act of unification was yet to come. That act belonged to Edward's son Athelstan, who ruled from 925 to 939 CE. And folks, if Alfred was the Great, Athelstan was arguably the greater. This is the king who truly forged England. He wasn't just king of the Anglo-Saxon, he was the first Rex Totius Britannia, king of all Britain. Think about that for a second. This wasn't just a regional ruler, this was a man who saw himself as sovereign over the entire island, a concept that would resonate for centuries. Athelstan was a brilliant statesman, a formidable warrior, and a deeply cultured individual. His court was a hub of learning and diplomacy, attracting scholars and ambassadors from across Europe. He married his sisters into royal houses across the continent, forging a network of alliances that gave England unprecedented international prestige. He reformed the coinage, standardized weights and measures, and issued laws that further solidified the legal and administrative framework of his burgeoning kingdom. He was in many ways the first truly European monarch of England. But Athelstan's defining moment, the one that cemented his legacy and the very existence of England, came in 937 CE at the Battle of Brunanburh. What a name, right? Brunanburh. We don't even know its exact location, which only adds to its legendary mystique. Here's the thing. Athelstan faced a massive, terrifying coalition. Imagine this, the King of Scotland, Constantine II, the Viking King of Dublin, Olaf Guthfrithson, and the King of Strathclyde, Owain. They united their forces, Scots, Norse Gaels, Vikings and Britons, in a desperate attempt to break Athelstan's growing power and reclaim their own independence. This wasn't just a skirmish, it was an epic clash. A battle of truly monumental scale for the age. Contemporary accounts like the Old English poem The Battle of Brunanburh, preserved in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, describe it as a slaughter, a day when the fields ran with blood. It was a brutal all-day affair, a grinding shield-wall-to-shield wall struggle, and Athelstan, alongside his younger brother Edmund, led his forces to a decisive, crushing victory. All 5 kings of the invading coalition were killed, along with countless warriors. Brunanburh wasn't just a military triumph, it was a psychological and political earthquake. It demonstrated that England, as a unified entity under a single king, was not only viable, but a force to be reckoned with. It cemented Athelstan's authority over the entire island, making the dream of a united English kingdom a reality. This battle is considered by many historians to be the moment when England truly became England. It forged a collective identity, a shared sense of triumph and belonging that would endure for centuries. It's a moment we should all know, a foundational epic for the nation. After Brunanburh, Athelstan's reign continued to be one of consolidation and stable governance. He fostered trade, promoted education, and continued to build on the administrative structures inherited from Alfred and Edward. When he died in 939 CE, he left behind a kingdom that was not only unified, but also respected and influential on the European stage. The period immediately following Athelstan, under his successors like Edmund I and Edgar the Peaceful, saw continued stability and the flourishing of Anglo-Saxon culture. Monasteries were reformed, scholarship thrived, and England enjoyed a period of relative peace and prosperity. The idea of Englishness continued to evolve, rooted in a shared language, law, and a sense of common destiny forged in the crucible of Viking wars and royal unification. But history, as we know, rarely offers long periods of uninterrupted tranquility. By the late 10th century, a new wave of Viking raids began, more organised and more devastating than before. This was the era of Ethelred the Unready, 978–1016 CE, a king whose reign was plagued by poor leadership, internal strife, and the increasingly desperate policy of paying Danegeld, protection money, to the Viking raiders. Think about this. You've just built this incredible unified kingdom, and then you have to literally buy off invaders. It's a sad chapter after such glorious triumphs. The Danegeld only seemed to encourage more raids, and eventually full-scale invasion. The most famous of these new Viking leaders was Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, who ultimately conquered England in 1013 CE, forcing Ethelred into exile. This was a massive blow, a temporary end to Anglo-Saxon rule. Sweyn died shortly after, but his son Cnut, often spelled Canute, completed the conquest and established a vast North Sea empire, ruling England, Denmark and Norway. Cnut, who reigned from 1016 to 1035 CE, is a fascinating figure. Despite being a foreign conqueror, he proved to be an effective and even enlightened ruler of England. He respected Anglo-Saxon law and institutions, fostered good relations with the Church, and brought a period of peace and stability after years of warfare. He even went on pilgrimage to Rome, demonstrating his commitment to Christian kingship. He was in many ways a successor to Athelstan's vision of a strong, unified, and internationally connected kingdom, albeit under Danish rather than Anglo-Saxon rule. After Cnut's death, his empire fragmented, and the Anglo-Saxon Wessex dynasty was briefly restored in 1042 CE with the return of Edward the Confessor, son of Ethelred the Unready. Edward was a pious king, but he was also childless, and his reign was characterised by the growing power of great aristocratic families, especially the Godwin family, led by the formidable Earl Godwin of Wessex, and later his son, Harold Godwinson. This period was a calm before the storm, a slow build-up of political tension and ambition that would erupt in one of the most transformative years in British history. And that, my friends, brings us to the year 1006. Just saying the date sends shivers down the spine of any history enthusiast, doesn't it? It's a year that fundamentally reshaped the trajectory of England, ending one era and dramatically beginning another. Edward the Confessor died in January 1066, and suddenly England had a massive succession crisis. There wasn't a clear heir, and three powerful men believed they had a legitimate claim to the throne. First there was Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, a man of immense wealth and influence, and Edward the Confessor's brother-in-law. The Anglo-Saxon Witan, Council of Wise Men, elected him king, and he was crowned just days after Edward's death. He represented the continuity of Anglo-Saxon rule and the will of the English magnates. Second, there was William, Duke of Normandy. He claimed that Edward the Confessor had promised him the throne years earlier, and that Harold Godwinson had sworn an oath to support his claim. Under duress, Harold would argue. William was a formidable, ruthless, and ambitious ruler, and he immediately began preparing an invasion fleet. Third, and often forgotten in the shadow of the other two, was Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, a legendary Viking warrior, often called the last great Viking. He also had a claim to the English throne, based on an earlier agreement between Knut's son Harthacnut and Harold's predecessor Magnus the Vustus. He saw an opportunity to revive Knut's North Sea Empire, so here's Harold Godwinson, King of England, facing invasion from two directions. It's an impossible situation, right? In September 1006, Harald Hardrada, allied with Harold Godwinson's own estranged brother Tostig, landed in Northumbria and began ravaging the north. Harold Godwinson, with incredible speed and determination, marched his English army over 180 miles north in just a few days. On September 25th, he caught Hardrada and Tostig by surprise at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. It was a brutal, decisive victory for the English. Hardrada and Tostig were both killed, and the Norwegian invasion was utterly crushed. It was a glorious triumph for Harold, a testament to his military prowess and the resilience of his Anglo-Saxon forces. But the celebrations were short-lived. Just 2 days later, on September 28th, William of Normandy landed his invasion fleet unopposed at Pevensey Bay in Sussex. Harold received the news while still in the north, exhausted from battle. He had to make an impossible decision: rest his troops and consolidate, or march south immediately to confront William. He chose the latter, embarking on another forced march, this time over 200 miles, picking up what reinforcements he could along the way. On October 14th, 1006, Harold Godwinson's battered and weary Anglo-Saxon army, arrayed on Senlac Hill near Hastings, faced William's Norman forces. The Battle of Hastings was a long, brutal, and utterly pivotal engagement. For much of the day, the English shield wall held firm against repeated Norman cavalry charges and archer volleys, but gradually, through a combination of feigned retreats, cavalry charges, and the sheer exhaustion of the English, the shield wall began to crack. The battle climaxed with the death of King Harold himself, famously, though perhaps apocryphally, struck in the eye by an arrow, then cut down by Norman knights. With their king fallen, the English resistance collapsed. The Normans had won. The Battle of Hastings wasn't just another battle, it was the end of Anglo-Saxon England. It marked the definitive end of the direct lineage of kings that stretched back to Alfred the Great. It meant the end of the Old English language as the language of power and government, replaced by Norman French. It meant a complete overhaul of the social and political structure, with the new Norman aristocracy replacing the Old English elite. It meant a new architectural style, new laws, new customs. The year 1066 was a seismic shift, a moment where the very fabric of British society was torn apart and rewoven into something fundamentally different. It was the moment England, as a distinct political and cultural entity, was reborn, but not without profound loss and change. The long, winding road from the earliest hominins, through the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Vikings, had reached an undeniable turning point. The stage was now set for a new chapter, one dominated by the French-speaking conquerors, but one that would ultimately forge the truly unique identity of the English nation we recognise today. The battle was over. Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king, lay dead, the hopes of an independent English monarchy shattered, on Senlac Hill. October 14th, 1066. It's a date etched into the very bedrock of English history, a moment so profoundly transformative that we're still feeling its ripples today. But what happened next? That's where the real story of the Norman conquest truly begins, because conquering a land is one thing. Holding it and fundamentally reshaping it is another beast entirely. William, now the Conqueror, didn't just waltz into London and claim his crown. Oh no, the Anglo-Saxon nobility, what was left of it, wasn't about to roll out the red carpet. Imagine the scene, a foreign invader dripping with the blood of their king marching toward their capital. Resistance, though fragmented, was immediate. London closed its gates. William, ever the pragmatist and the brutal strategist, decided to make a point. He didn't storm the city directly. Instead, he systematically ravaged the surrounding countryside, Kent, Surrey, Hampshire, burning farms, destroying villages. This wasn't just about plunder, it was psychological warfare. It was a clear, chilling message. Resist me, and this is what awaits you. This tactic worked. The message was received loud and clear. By December, with winter setting in and no viable leader to rally around, the remaining English magnates, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, offered William the crown. And so on Christmas Day 1006 in Westminster Abbey, William of Normandy was crowned King of England. Here's the thing that blows my mind. This wasn't just a change of monarch. This was a complete, utter, top-to-bottom societal overhaul. We talk about invasions and conquests often, but rarely do they result in such a total decapitation of the existing power structure. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, the very people who had governed England for centuries, were systematically dispossessed. Gone. Replaced. Think about it. Almost overnight, the land, the wealth, the power, it all shifted. William declared himself the owner of all land in England, every single acre. From him, it was then granted out to his loyal Norman barons, knights, and bishops in exchange for their military service and fealty. This wasn't a subtle shift. It was a brutal, efficient act of state-sponsored theft on an unprecedented scale. If you were an Anglo-Saxon lord, you lost everything. If you were a peasant, your lord simply changed, and you often found yourself facing a master who spoke a different language, worshipped in a slightly different way, and held you in utter contempt. This new system, the Norman feudal system, was a pyramid scheme of power, with William at the apex. He was the ultimate landlord, and everyone else held their land from him. This ensured loyalty, because if you rebelled, you didn't just lose your head. You lost your entire estate, which would then be parcelled out to someone more trustworthy. This was the foundation of Norman power, reinforced by the rapid construction of castles. We picture castles as romantic, towering structures, don't we? But in the immediate aftermath of 1006, they were instruments of oppression. William and his men built hundreds of motte and bailey castles, simple, quick-to-construct wooden towers on artificial mounds surrounded by palisades. These weren't just defensive, they were offensive. They were visible symbols of Norman dominance, strategically placed to control key routes, towns, and rebellious areas. From these strongholds, Norman garrisons could project power, collect taxes, and crush any local resistance. Imagine living in a village looking up to see one of these foreign fortresses rising on the hill, a constant chilling reminder of who was in charge now. And resistance there was. The Anglo-Saxons didn't just roll over. There were uprisings in Kent, in the West Country, and most notoriously in the north. Here, William unleashed his most brutal act of consolidation, the harrying of the north between 1069 and 1070. Faced with repeated rebellions, often aided by Danish invaders, William systematically laid waste to vast swathes of Yorkshire and other northern counties. Crops were burned, livestock slaughtered, villages razed. Famine followed, killing tens of thousands. It was a scorched earth policy designed to break the spirit of the North, to ensure that no future rebellion could ever draw sustenance from that land. It was a horrifying, calculated act of terror, and it worked. The North remained desolate for decades, a stark monument to William's ruthlessness. To solidify his control, and, crucially, to understand what he now owned, William commissioned one of the most remarkable administrative documents in European history, the Domesday Book. Completed in 1086, this wasn't just a survey, it was a comprehensive inventory of England. Every village, every manor, every pig, every plough, every freeman, every serf, who owned what before the conquest, and who owned what now. It was a census, a tax assessment, and a legal record all rolled into one. The sheer scale of this undertaking, just 2 decades after the invasion, is astounding. It tells us so much about the meticulous, legalistic, and utterly controlling nature of the Norman regime. For the conquered, it felt like a judgment day, hence the name Domesday, a judgment from which there was no appeal. Now, let's talk about the cultural earthquake that followed. The arrival of the Normans fundamentally reshaped the language, the law, and the very identity of England. For centuries, England had been an Anglo-Saxon kingdom speaking Old English with a strong Germanic cultural base. After 1006, the language of power became Norman French. The king, his court, the nobility, the church hierarchy, the legal system, all conducted their affairs in French. English, the language of the vast majority of the population, was relegated to the status of a peasant tongue. But here's the fascinating twist. English didn't die, it survived, simmering beneath the surface, evolving. Over the next few centuries, Old English, stripped of its complex grammatical inflections and absorbing thousands of French words, began to transform into what we call Middle English. Think about it. Our everyday language is a living testament to this conquest. Words like cow, Old English, and beef, Norman French, pig and pork, sheep and mutton. The animal in the field had an English name. The meat on the Lord's table had a French one. This linguistic layering is a hauntingly direct connection to that period of dominance and subservience. Beyond language, the Normans brought their own architectural style, Romanesque, which we now call Norman architecture. Massive, thick-walled cathedrals and castles with rounded arches, replacing the more delicate Anglo-Saxon structures. They brought a more centralized, bureaucratic system of government, a legal system that would eventually blend with existing Anglo-Saxon customs to form the basis of English common law. They brought new ideas about chivalry, about warfare, about land tenure. For the ancient Britons, or rather their direct descendants, the Anglo-Saxons, this was a profound loss. Their culture, their language, their ruling class, their distinct identity, all were subjugated. They became, in effect, a conquered people within their own land, ruled by an alien elite. This wasn't just a shift in who sat on the throne. It was a fundamental redefinition of who we were. We imagine England before the conquest as one thing and England after as another. But the truth is, the Norman conquest didn't just change England, it created a new kind of England, one that was inextricably linked to continental Europe, especially France, for centuries to come. It forged a new identity, one that would eventually blend the Anglo-Saxon and Norman elements into something unique. The island, once a relatively insular Anglo-Saxon kingdom, was now firmly integrated into the political and cultural tapestry of Western Europe, its gaze turned south and east, away from its traditional Germanic roots. The legacy of 1066 is truly epic in scale. It set the stage for the Plantagenet kings, the 100 Years' War, the very development of the English language as we know it, and the unique dual identity of the English people, a blend of Germanic and Romance influences. It was a moment when the story of the ancient inhabitants of this island took another dramatic, irreversible turn, laying the groundwork for the nation that would one day emerge from this crucible of conquest and cultural collision. The ancient Britons, in their various forms, had experienced many invaders and settlers over millennia, but none had left such an indelible, all-encompassing mark as the Normans. The island was no longer just a place. It was now a kingdom, forcefully unified and fundamentally remade, ready to embark on a new, tumultuous chapter of its history. And so, with Harold Godwinson's demise on Senlac Hill, and William the Conqueror's subsequent brutal consolidation of power, the very fabric of England was not merely altered, it was utterly, irrevocably rewoven. Think about this for a moment. It wasn't just a new king on the throne, it was a complete, top-down, systemic overhaul of every single aspect of society. When we talk about the Norman conquest, we're not just talking about a battle, we're talking about the end of one England and the violent birth of another. William, this formidable, calculating duke from Normandy, understood that conquest wasn't just about winning a battle, it was about holding the land, and to hold it, he had to control it. His solution was ingenious in its brutality and efficiency, the feudal system. Imagine a pyramid, stark and unyielding, with William at its apex. He declared himself the sole owner of all land in England, a staggering claim, but one he enforced with an iron fist. He then granted vast tracts of this land to his most loyal Norman barons, his trusted lieutenants who had fought by his side at Hastings. But here's the kicker. These grants weren't absolute ownership. They were fiefs, held in return for service, primarily military. Each baron in turn subdivided his land among his own knights, who also owed military service. And at the very bottom, supporting this entire edifice, were the vast majority of the population, the Anglo-Saxon peasants, tied to the land, working it for their Norman lords. The Domesday Book, which we touched upon, wasn't just a census, it was a weapon. It meticulously recorded every acre, every ox, every pig, every freeman, and every slave. It was an inventory of a conquered nation, designed to assess what William owned and what taxes and services he could extract. It left no stone unturned, no corner uncounted, making it virtually impossible for anyone to dispute the king's claims or hide resources. It's a chilling testament to absolute power, and it gives us an unprecedented snapshot of an entire kingdom in the late 11th century. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, the thegns and earls who had ruled for centuries, were systematically dispossessed. Their lands were confiscated, their power stripped away. Many were killed in battle or in the subsequent rebellions, others fled into exile, some clung to what little they could, marrying into the new Norman elite. But their ancient lines of authority were broken. Overnight, the language of power shifted from Old English to Norman French. The men who now sat in judgment, who commanded armies, who built castles, spoke a different tongue, worshipped in a slightly different manner, and had a distinctly continental outlook. This brings us to one of the most profound and fascinating consequences of the conquest, the birth of Middle English. For centuries, England became a trilingual society. Latin remained the language of the church, law, and formal records. Norman French was the language of the court, the nobility, and increasingly the legal system and government. And Old English, in various regional dialects, was the spoken language of the vast majority of the population, the farmers, the artisans, the servants. Now here's the thing that blows my mind. For a long time these languages coexisted, but they weren't entirely separate. Over generations, French words, concepts, and grammatical structures began to seep into English. The children of Norman lords, growing up surrounded by English-speaking servants and peasants, would inevitably pick up English. The English peasantry, dealing with their Norman overlords, would absorb French terms. It wasn't a sudden switch, it was a slow, organic, messy process of linguistic osmosis. Words for government, law, food, fashion and art often came from French. Parliament, justice, beef, pork, fashion, beauty. Words for farming, basic animals and everyday life largely remained English. Cow, sheep, bread, water, The result? A language far richer, more complex and more flexible than either Old English or Norman French alone. This gradual fusion is how we got the English language we speak today, a magnificent mongrel born of conquest and cultural collision. Culturally, the changes were equally dramatic. The landscape itself began to reflect the new order. The Motte and Bailey Castle, a quickly constructed but highly effective defensive structure, became ubiquitous. These wooden, later stone fortresses, perched on artificial mounds, were not just military strongholds. They were symbols of Norman dominance, visible reminders to the subjugated population of who was in charge. We see a shift from the burghs of Alfred the Great to these formidable, often brutal, keeps. The church, too, was brought firmly under Norman control. William replaced almost all Anglo-Saxon bishops and abbots with Normans, ensuring that this powerful institution, with its vast land holdings and intellectual influence, was loyal to him. New cathedrals built in the Romanesque style, massive, solid, with rounded arches and thick walls, began to rise across the country, dwarfing the older, more modest Anglo-Saxon churches. These weren't just places of worship, they were statements of power, wealth, and a new, continental architectural aesthetic. William the Conqueror died in 1087, leaving behind a kingdom fundamentally transformed but still held together by his immense personal will. His death, however, plunged his domains into a familiar medieval problem: succession. He had 3 sons: Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy, William Rufus, William II, King of England, and Henry, who would become Henry I. The separation of Normandy and England under 2 different rulers immediately created tension and conflict, a pattern that would plague Anglo-French relations for centuries. William II, known as William Rufus, was a strong-willed, often ruthless king, but he lacked his father's strategic foresight. He was a warrior, spending much of his reign campaigning in Normandy, Scotland and Wales. His relationship with the church was often fraught, exemplified by his turbulent dealings with Archbishop Anselm of Canterbury. Rufus met an untimely and mysterious end in 1100, shot by an arrow while hunting in the New Forest. Was it an accident? A conspiracy? We'll never truly know, but his younger brother Henry, conveniently present in the forest, wasted no time in seizing the crown. Henry I, known as Beauclerc, fine scholar, for his education, was a different kind of king. He was intelligent, pragmatic, and determined to restore stability. He understood the need to bridge the divide between his Norman aristocracy and the Anglo-Saxon populace. In a shrewd political move, he married Edith, renamed Matilda, a princess of Scotland and, crucially, a direct descendant of the Anglo-Saxon kings of England. This marriage, though perhaps not one of great love, was a powerful symbolic gesture, aiming to unite the 2 disparate peoples under a single crown. He also worked to strengthen royal administration and the legal system, laying foundations for future developments. Henry's reign, however, was marked by tragedy. His only legitimate son, William Adelin, drowned in the White Ship disaster in 1120, leaving Henry without a male heir. This was a catastrophic blow, not just personally, but for the future of England. Henry spent the rest of his life trying to secure the succession for his daughter, Matilda. He made his barons swear oaths of loyalty to her, but the idea of a woman ruling England was, for many, anathema. When Henry I died in 1135, those oaths were quickly forgotten. His nephew Stephen of Blois, a popular and well-connected Norman baron, seized the throne. This sparked one of the most brutal and chaotic periods in English history, known as the Anarchy. For nearly 2 decades, England was torn apart by civil war between the forces of Stephen and those loyal to Empress Matilda. She had married Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, and was mother to the future Henry II. Imagine a country where law and order utterly collapsed. Barons, many of whom had built castles without royal permission, waged private wars, plundering and extorting the populace. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in a chilling passage, describes how Christ and his saints slept during this time. It was a period of immense suffering for the ordinary people, caught between warring factions, their lands ravaged, their lives forfeit to the whims of ruthless warlords. It was a stark reminder of how fragile central authority could be, even after the strong foundations laid by William the Conqueror and Henry I. The anarchy finally drew to a close with the Treaty of Winchester, or Wallingford, in 1153. Stephen, exhausted and having lost his own son, recognised Matilda's son Henry as his heir. When Stephen died the following year, Henry of Anjou ascended the throne as Henry II, marking the beginning of the Plantagenet dynasty. Henry II was a force of nature. Energetic, intelligent and ambitious, he inherited not just England, but a vast Angevin empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, encompassing Normandy, Anjou, Maine and Aquitaine. He was more French lord than English king in many ways, but he was determined to restore royal authority and bring order back to his English realm. And he did. Henry II is perhaps best remembered for his legal reforms, which laid the very foundations of English common law. He introduced the concept of royal justice being accessible to all free men, establishing a system of itinerant judges, justices in ire, who travelled the country, dispensing the king's justice. He also formalised the use of juries in land disputes and criminal cases, a revolutionary concept that began to replace trial by ordeal or combat. These reforms were transformative, creating a more centralised, consistent and equitable, for its time, legal system that still influences legal systems around the world today. However, Henry's reign was not without its struggles. His most famous conflict was with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Becket, once Henry's loyal chancellor and close friend, became a staunch defender of the church's independence from royal control after his appointment as archbishop. The clash between church and crown over matters of jurisdiction, particularly over whether clerics accused of crime should be tried in royal or ecclesiastical courts, escalated dramatically. The infamous confrontation led to Becket's murder in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170 by 4 of Henry's knights, who, misinterpreting Henry's frustrated outburst, believed they were carrying out his will. This act sent shockwaves across Europe and forced Henry into a humiliating penance, but it ultimately strengthened the church's position, at least for a time, and enshrined Becket as a martyr. So, as we bring this chapter to a close, consider the journey we've just taken. From the imposition of Norman rule and the creation of a feudal society, through the linguistic blending that gave birth to Middle English, the period of devastating civil war, and finally the emergence of the powerful Plantagenet kings who would fundamentally reshape England's legal and administrative landscape. The ancient Britain of pre-Roman times, the Anglo-Saxon of Bede's era, had long since faded into myth and memory. What we now see is a complex hybrid nation, forged in conquest, defined by its new Anglo-Norman identity and inextricably linked to the political and cultural currents of continental Europe. The story of England, and indeed the Britons within it, was now set on an entirely new, profoundly different course.